Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague from Vancouver East for the benefit of her years of experience in this House to be able to talk about those issues. I need to let you know, Mr. Speaker, I'll be splitting my time with my friend from Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in the House to support Bill S-14, an act to amend the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act. And I do so because, well, for a number of reasons. The bill itself is making four main changes to the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act. I'll enumerate these and elaborate on them a bit, Mr. Speaker. It increases the maximum sentence of imprisonment applicable to the offense of bribing a foreign public official from 5 to 14 years. It eliminates an exception for the so-called facilitation payments where a foreign official is paid to expedite the execution of their responsibilities. It creates a new offense for falsifying or concealing books or records in order to bribe or conceal bribery of a foreign official. And it establishes nationality jurisdiction that would apply to all the offenses under the Act, such that Canadian nationals could be prosecuted for offenses committed overseas. Now, having said, noted my support for the bill, Mr. Speaker, I do want to take a moment to comment on the process by which this bill comes before us in this House. It is of concern, Mr. Speaker, that we get to this place by way of a 2011 report from Transparency International, and that organization ranked Canada as the worst of all G7 countries with regards to international bribery, with, quote, little or no enforcement, end quote, of the scant legislation that exists in this country on these matters. And this is to say, Mr. Speaker, that we, Canada, needed to be named and shamed publicly, internationally, for our lax legislation and approach to these issues of corrupting public officials in other countries. I also want to comment on the timing of this, and this is a curious pathology of this government, Mr. Speaker. They've been in power through minority and now majority government since 2006. And it seems to elude them that they've been here 7 years, and that, in fact, all that they do now, Mr. Speaker, they've been in power so long, is really an indictment of their own conduct as a government. Implicit in this kind of legislation here, Mr. Speaker, is an indictment of what they have failed to do over the previous 7 years in government. And I note that the parliamentary secretary earlier today justified this particular bill, S-14, on the basis of the fact that we are a trading nation. Well, Mr. Speaker, we were a trading nation in 2006 when they came to power as well. And in fact, we've always been a trading nation. We've always been a very open economy, Mr. Speaker, with goods coming and going to and from this country to other places around the world. And so when did dawn rise over Marblehead, Mr. Speaker, so that this government realizes that we've always been a trading nation? The issues that this bill is meant to address existed in 2006 just as well as they existed in 2013. And it seemed to have taken a series of really national embarrassments, largely in the extractive industry, Mr. Speaker, to get this government to recognize that they needed some legislation such as the act that we have before us. But it's still not clear, Mr. Speaker, after all of this, that they embrace this legislation. We had before in this House C-300, Mr. Speaker, and that was a bill that would have required extractive companies receiving government support to meet certain standards, as well as establishing a system for issuing and assessing complaints against such companies. And this government saw fit, Mr. Speaker, to whip that vote and defeat that legislation. And we had as well, Mr. Speaker, the spectacle of the Foreign Affairs Minister introducing Canadian firms to the transition government in Libya before the United Nations could even assess the needs of a post-conflict Libya. And among the companies that, according to media reports, that our Minister of Foreign Affairs took to Libya was, in fact, SNC-Lavalin, Mr. Speaker. I mean, this is a company who's having contracts investigated in 10 different countries. It's a company that's been banned from bidding on World Bank projects for 10 years. And this is a government that only very recently saw fit to take SNC-Lavalin back into Libya to introduce them to a transition government. And we know, too, Mr. Speaker, that to date there have only been 3 convictions on these matters. And I would cite, since 1999, I'd cite the HydroClean Group was being fined for $25,000 in January 2005. Nico Resources Limited was fined in 2011. Because its subsidiary in Bangladesh had paid for vehicle and travel expenses for a former Bangladeshi state minister. Griffiths Energy International was fined for $10 million in January 2013 after it agreed to pay a $2 million bribe to the wife of Chad's ambassador to Canada, and so on, Mr. Speaker. But that's only 3 convictions since 1999. And all of this seeming reluctance, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of this government to bring forth legislation like this, I think is confirmed by the source of this bill, and that's the Senate. This, Mr. Speaker, the Senate I'm referring to, is an institution with an enormous legitimacy deficit.
Order the honourable member for Burlington is rising on point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's consultations among the parties, and I believe it is possible that you could find unanimous consent for the following motion. That Bill S-14, an act to amend the Canada National Parks Act and the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Resources Accord Implementation Act, and to make consequential amendments to the Canada Shipping Act 2001 be taken up at the report stage later today.
The members have heard. Does the honourable member have unanimous consent to propose the motion? Yes? The members have heard the terms of the motion. Does the honourable member have unanimous support for the motion? Yes? Agreed? And so ordered. Resuming debate. Order. Resuming debate. The honourable member for Beaches East York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was just in the process of commenting on the source of this legislation being the Senate and the enormous legitimacy deficit that exists in the Senate. I think that's historical, but it is particularly acute these days. And in particular, the Senate really is in no position to be issuing bills on the issue of corruption, mired as it is, Mr. Speaker, in scandals of exactly that nature. But having said all that, irrespective of the source, and as unfortunate as the source of this legislation is, we remain prepared to support the bill, Mr. Speaker. And one of the central reasons for doing this, Mr. Speaker, is found in the legislative history of members of this party in this House. We have long supported clear rules requiring transparency and accountability by Canadian individuals and corporations overseas. And this bill, in fact, complements legislative efforts by NDP MPs to encourage responsible, sustainable, and transparent management practices. And I speak specifically, Mr. Speaker, of bills put forward by the member for Burnaby New Westminster, C-323, that allows lawsuits in Canadian courts by non-Canadians for violations of international obligations, and also C-486, Mr. Speaker, from the member for Ottawa Centre that requires public due diligence by companies using minerals from the Great Lakes region of Africa. These bills reflect the history of our party. It reflects a respect for the democratic aspirations of people in other countries, a respect for their aspirations for better labor standards, for healthier and safer environment. Mr. Speaker, we understand that effective environmental and labor standards in developing countries often depend on advocacy and activism by local populations. And it's very difficult for local people to hold their governments to account when the government has secret sources of revenue that remove the financial incentive to be accountable in the first place. And we support this bill as well, Mr. Speaker, because the lack of anti-bribery enforcement in Canada has been a national embarrassment to us. How much more time do I have, Mr. Speaker? Less than a minute. Okay. Well, I will skip to my conclusion on this point, Mr. Speaker, of the national embarrassment of the lack of legislation. It is worth, I think, pointing out, in spite of our support for this bill, that this bill is in effect totally underwhelming. One is left asking, is that all there is? When the parliamentary secretary points to the openness of our country to international trade and offers forward this legislation as the solution to dealing with corruption issues in such an open and global environment. When Canadians take such pride and value so highly our reputation in the international scene, the question rises, why does this government always seem to aim so low, Mr. Speaker? Why can't this government, in fact, aspire to a leadership role, one that I think Canadians could justly take pride in? If it is worth putting forward such legislation, and we certainly believe it is, why not set new and higher standards internationally, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that Canadians overseas conduct their affairs to the highest levels of transparency and ethics? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.